In this lecture, we're going to create some routes. We'll be working on the router file we reviewed in the previous lecture. The routes are outsourced in a variable called routes. This array is what we'll want to modify if we're going to add some routes. The view router expects this array to be an array of objects. Each object represents a route. In the documentation, each object is referred to as a route record. We'll add a new route record to the array. The first route we'll create will be a route for the home page. We previously cleared the array, which removed the route for the home page. This empty array will leave our app broken for a moment. We'll want to add it back in. The first property we'll add is called path. The value for this must be a string. The path property represents the part of the URL after the domain. Let's say you had a domain called example.com. If you set the path property to /about, then this is the record that will be used if anyone visits the URL example.com/about. For our first route, we'll be creating one for the home page. We'll set this to a / character. The next property we'll need to set is the component property. Whenever a user visits the application, the router will retrieve the path from the URL. It'll try to match the path with the records we've registered. If it finds a match, it'll load the component related to the record. We can set the component with the component property. The value for this must be the component object. For the past few sections, we've been creating components in the components directory. There's another directory for components called views. This directory is where you define components that will act as the container for the page's content. It's common practice to store generic components in the components directory. Components that will render the page's main content should be placed in the views directory. Let's open this directory. We'll find two components called home and about. In an earlier lecture, we cleared out the home component. We're going to use this component to render the content for the home page. The great thing about using the router is we don't have to change anything about how we create components. Components are still made up of the template, script, and style blocks. We have access to the same lifecycle functions. The only difference is where we define our components. This structure is to keep things organized. Let's begin loading the component for the record. In the router file, we're going to import the home component. I'm using the @ symbol to point to the source directory. This shortcut makes it easier to import the component without having to guess where we are. Next, we have to set the component property for the home record to the component we imported. Voila! We've created our first route. Now whenever a user visits this path, the view router will render this component onto the page. Let's try creating another route as an exercise. We'll create another route record for the About page. Inside the Views directory, View has provided us with an About component. We might as well use it. Open the About component. We're going to leave it with a basic template. There shouldn't be any script or style blocks. Next, let's go back to the router file. We'll create another record in the array. Inside the record, we'll set the path property to /about. Then, we'll set the component property to the About component. The About component isn't available. We'll need to import it. We're finished adding routes. We'll add more routes later in the course. Before we view the front end, let's adjust the content in the home component file. Open it in your editor. We'll add the template block. The content for this component can be found inside the app component. It's the root component of the application. The app component's template is based on the index.html static file. It's where the homepage content is placed. We'll want to move the sections that will act as the main content. We've taken care of moving the header and authentication sections into separate components. This will leave us with the introduction, main content, and player sections. The player is something we'll put into a separate component. The other two sections will be used for the main content. We'll cut both sections from the app component. Then, we'll paste them into the template block of the home component. We'll leave the component with static content. The purpose of adding content is to check if the router is working by rendering different content based on the URL. The very last thing we'll need to do is to tell the router where to display the content. It won't magically guess where it should display the content. It also won't replace the entire document with the component. That's a good thing because we won't have to load the header or authentication components repeatedly. It's our job to instruct the router where to load the content. Let's switch to the app component. We're going to want to load the content where we previously removed it. Below the app header component, load the component router view. The View Router plugin registers this component. It was defined when we registered the View Router module as a plugin. It's a global component. We don't need to do anything else to get this to work. The View Router will automatically know which component to load based on the route records we created in the router. This component will be replaced with the correct component associated with the path. Let's test the application in the browser. The page will continue to render normally. It'll look the same. We'll find the introduction message along with the list of songs. Let's inspect the console for errors. The router is working like we wanted. The question is, do the other routes in our application work? We'll look at how we can view other pages by discussing the history mode in the next lecture.